That's usually what you hear whenever people talk about Inception or anything that Christopher Nolan does. And lately, with the new movie that came out, Tenet, I want to talk about why it's such a great movie and the reason I don't understand people talk about the music so much. Because I understand, yeah, it's a lot of loud noises, but I think like that's to help you get into the mood, and it's also to keep you awake. Because I, for one, have never fallen asleep during a Christopher Nolan movie, but I've fallen asleep into plenty of other movies that I was just like. So here's the thing about that. Tenet is an absolutely amazing movie, and even though it involves time travel, it's not exactly what you think. Because most people, when they go back and they watch this movie, they're just like, oh, how did someone get back to their timeline, and like, how do they make it back to where they were? And the thing is, they never don't. And that's the weird thing about timelines that I think is really good about what this movie does. Because the main point of the movie, I think, is to show that no matter what you believe, you have to keep going. And I know that's kind of weird and kind of put weirdly, but I mean, hopefully when I get through with all this, you'll understand. Now, the beginning of the movie, it starts off and you have the protagonist. And that's literally what his name is, the protagonist. You don't get a name, he's just the protagonist. And what I think this does is to help pull you into the seat of the protagonist, where you're just like, alright, I'm with this person, I'm right on this person's shoulders, I'm with them through everything. And with that, it sets the tone for what the movie is about. Because the movie is about time travel and going back in time and fixing things and trying to stop basically a grandfather paradox from destroying the world and reversing time and destroying everything in existence. And the way that this is told in movie format, I think, is why this I couldn't imagine this book in I couldn't imagine this as a book or like a comic. Like, it had to be done in movie form. And a lot of people talk about like how did the main character, the protagonist, get back to where he was on his timeline. And the thing was, he never did. See, if you follow him throughout the movie, he goes to the opera, and you keep going, and a lot of people were just like, oh, what happened? Well, he just lived the same week twice, basically. Like, as you keep going through, he basically goes back in time with Neil, and then they live that same week through again, and then they keep going. So basically all it did was waste a week of time of his life reliving the same week. So it's not like, he went back in time, he got back to there, and then he continued living off from that. Like, he still had to live out that time that he was in there. So there's never really a branch of reality to get to. It's just him going forward, because according to him and what he sees and what he perceives, it's all just one steady flow. There is no like bump, bump, bump. Like, he continuously went forward no matter what it seemed like in his mind. And that's the thing about the movie in general, because if you go all the way towards the end, like, one of my favorite like sayings in any movie ever was what Neil says to him at the end. And Neil tells him, what's happened, which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing. And I believe that is something that's very, very important, because a lot of things that are talked about today are, oh, we're in a simulation, or we're in a dream, or aliens are coming, so it's the end of the world. And I think that's just a very negative way to look at it, because one thing that he's saying, especially in this movie, and I think it kind of goes back to Inception as well, where at the end of the movie, the whole point isn't whether or not he's in a dream or not. The point is that whether he's in a dream or in reality, he chooses to accept that as what is real, and that he's going to move forward and make the best of it with what he can. And the same way as in Tenet, whenever he says that phrase, what's happened, which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. Now, when he says an expression of faith, it's a belief in the mechanics, how things work in our world. So regardless of you're in a simulation, you're in a dream world, whatever, you have to choose that it is your reality, because right after he says, what do you call it? And he says, reality. Because that's all it can ever be to you. You can't be like, well, I'm in a dream, so I'm just going to fuck off and not act like it's important, or I'm in simulation, so none of this matters. You have to make anything matter, okay? If you're in a dream, if you're in a simulation, you need to make the best of it no matter what is going on. And that's what I think this movie really points out to, is that there's not an excuse to do nothing. People keep trying to find a reason to be like, oh, I just want to give up, or there's no point. But really, you need to just keep going, because that's the whole point. And I think that's the beautiful thing about Tenet, is because Tenet wasn't founded in the past, it was founded in the future. So what he's saying is, you can't just give up and be like, alright, we're good, because they're going to have time travel in the future and they're going to come and save us. Because you have to get to that future for them to come back, okay? And that's the crazy thing about what happens, because when you think about reality as a whole, as all of us together, it doesn't make sense. But if you follow your own self, it makes sense. Because like Neil said, you have a future in the past. And that's to him. That's to his past. He had a future in it. But to Neil, there was no future. Neil was about to go back in there, jump back in time, and then get shot in the head in order to save the protagonist so he could go on and save the world. Now, that also is another beautiful thing, I think, about a bunch of tiny things sprinkled throughout this movie, is because if you remember at the beginning, whenever the protagonist first meets Kat, she sees she's sending Neil off, and the protagonist is like, that's a cute kid. And what she says is actually very, very important, because she says, he's everything. And then she turns around and then they start talking again. But that he's everything is actually very true, because if he didn't come back to save him at the opera, and then also to catch the bullet in the head for him right then there would have been no saving the world, and Neil wouldn't have been alive in the first place. And that's where it starts to really, really mess with your brain, because you're just like, well, then which came first and whatnot? And there is no answer, as Neil said. It's a paradox. It's a paradox when you try to put all of our realities together. But as long as you follow your own timeline and you keep moving forward, and you're like, I know what I'm going to do, and I know what I'm going to try and make the world a better place or make myself better, then you can accomplish that. But when you try to think about the answer to everything, it's impossible to do. Now, as far as some of the aspects of the movie about people talking about who's who and what's what, I've seen some pretty interesting theories. I mean, for one, I do just want to say that Neil is definitely Max, and the way that you can definitely prove this is because of what he says at the end when he says, you wouldn't even watch Kat from afar, and he smiles at the protagonist because he knows deep down he already knew what happened. It was in his past. So he already knows what's going to happen. The protagonist doesn't know what's going to happen. And if I may make another, just to throw it out there, I'm thinking that Neil is actually the name of the protagonist, because where in the world did he get Neil from? Neil's a random name, don't get me wrong, but his name was Max, and obviously he changed his name so that way he wouldn't know if that was the same person. But multiple people can have the name Max, and then two, where would Neil come from? So I'm thinking maybe Neil is actually the name of the protagonist, and it could be or can't be, it doesn't really matter, but if it is, it's just kind of cool thing right there to make everything connected. And I also understand that there's some dismissal about what happened, because if Neil went back in time and then Kat killed his dad, then how did he technically get there? But there's not really a grandfather paradox in that sense, because his father died after Max was born. So therefore him dying doesn't really affect him ever being born. It just affects how things happen, which it really didn't affect anything, because what's happened's already happened. See, all those things happened in Neil's life anyways before it even got to the point where he met the protagonist, and then the protagonist found a Tenet, and then they go back in time and do their thing. And also with the whole everybody's going back in time, I really believe that Neil just went back in time once, and he got all the way back to where the opera was, and then he started moving forward from then. And the only time he ever goes back again is whenever he goes back with the protagonist to save Kat, and he keeps moving forward. Which is also another kind of thing that I think is really cool about the movie, is that the whole time Neil's there and he's explaining things to Kat and he's explaining to the protagonist, he's actually taking care of his own mother, and she has no idea. And I think that's just a beautiful thing to me, because Neil keeps that shit together, and it just makes me really love Robert Pattinson. It's probably one of my favorite roles he's ever been in. I really hope that what I've said, my ramblings, have kind of helped you understand the movie a little bit better. If it hasn't, let me know. If it did, let me know. If you think what I'm talking about just makes me sound like an idiot, also let me know that too. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to y'all later.